Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. I think you're obviously here because you realize that Ebola is a big issue and there's an epidemic now that's been going for some time in Democratic Republic of Congo. It's the second largest Ebola epidemic in history. There was, of course, a bigger one in East Africa 5 years ago that only eventually died out in 2016. This one is potentially more serious because it's located in an area of persistent conflict that's affected the attempt to control the disease. And it's located near a major border with Uganda, where there's a real risk of the disease spreading and becoming an international epidemic. Ebola is a scary disease if you read about it. Once you have it, your chances of survival are in the neighborhood of 50%. I guess that's the official WHO figure, but when you look at the numbers for people being treated in this epidemic, it's actually up above 60%. I guess one of the fortunate things is it's somewhat limited in its transmission because it has to come from the bodily fluids of someone who's already got the disease. But it means extreme measures of quarantine. The treatment centers are scary in themselves just to be in my impression. We have people who have actually been there, so we'll hear from them in a moment. And for reasons that I guess we'll explore this afternoon, the treatment centers have encountered some surprising violent attacks and a good deal of community resistance. So the techniques that were used in West Africa to contain it, to keep it from spreading, don't seem to be working as well in DRC, and that's a matter of real great concern. We're fortunate in having some very distinguished, knowledgeable people here to share their thoughts with us. And our leading speaker is going to be Admiral Tim Ziemer, who attempted to retire from the Navy after a 30-year career doing almost everything, including flying off aircraft carriers, doing various operational commands, very senior commands of senior job on the Joint Staff. But as they say in the Pentagon, he's failed retirement miserably. First going to work for I think actually running an organization called World Relief that focused on disaster assistance and other assistance to developing countries. And then where I first met him in 2006 was when President George W. Bush asked him to come, having done a great deal for HIV, the Bush administration having done a great deal for HIV/AIDS, decided that we needed to tackle malaria and saw in Admiral Ziemer somebody who knew how to run things. And so Tim became the head of the President's Malaria Initiative, in which he did a spectacular job. He was appointed by this administration to be the Senior Director for Global Health Security and Biodefense at the National Security Council staff. Held that position up until July 2018, when he became the Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator. I've had titles like that in the past. The title is longer than your resume. Of the Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance at AID. Some of us, this discussion is on the record, but I will say in my own name that I think he should be made in charge of all U.S. government efforts in combating Ebola. I know you want more work to do, but it seems to me there might be less work if you were actually put in charge. So please join me in welcoming Admiral Ziemer.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, Paul, and to AEI for hosting this afternoon event. This is my 6th Ebola meeting today. And I just want to thank AEI for being engaged, interested, but more importantly, as you understand and get involved from your different organizations and offices, that you'll continue to look at this as a significant global issue. I've been asked to give you a couple high-level points that will help facilitate the panel discussion, which in these types of forums really is where the bread and butter value of coming together is. But I want to just make a couple high-level observations and comments on how the United States government is prioritizing this infectious disease outbreak and how we're working with the government of DRC and WHO to do everything we can to get our arms around this and contain this outbreak. So why is this an issue? Strategically and from a policy perspective, why do we really care? And I think it's really important to highlight that if you had a chance to read the National Security Strategy in Pillar 1, it clearly articulates that it is in our national interest to prevent, respond, and contain infectious diseases at their source. Building on the National Security Strategy is the National Biodefense Strategy, and it clearly reiterates the national imperative to deal with that, to fund, identify, and then respond appropriately. And then to piggyback on all of that is the Global Health Security Agenda, which was launched by the Obama administration on the heels of the 2014 Ebola outbreak and then continued under the Trump administration. So when you package the policy direction and the strategic imperative of what infectious diseases are and how they relate to our national interests, it's clear that this bubbles right up to the top as a national security interest. We know, all of us in this room, the adverse impact of infectious diseases, flu, Zika, other outbreaks that have manifested themselves in different ways. A lot of reference is made to the 2014 West Africa outbreak. When we look at this outbreak, that was a very challenging moment for the global health community. Many lessons learned came out of that. With the current outbreak in DRC, it came on the heels of the 9th outbreak in DRC. The previous 9 were addressed and contained in a matter of months in a fairly routine way. Everybody was kind of patting themselves on the back. We knew what to do, how to do it, and how to get these things under control. But unlike West Africa, our efforts here in the second largest outbreak, we have not only been unsuccessful, the situation is bad and it's going to get worse. And the yellow lights are blinking all over the place. So now in the 10th month, when it first went, the original strategic funding plan was for 4 to 5 months. So now 10 months into this, we're passing through 2,300 cases and 1,522 deaths. And that number continues to accelerate. So we're at a very, very critical phase. And hence, it's really important for folks like you to spend a few minutes in your afternoon to understand and then determine your role and where you fit in and how we might respond. In addition to the increased outbreak in the 2 primary provinces in northeast Congo, we, in the last 2 weeks, had an outbreak that crossed the border into Uganda. There were 6 cases, several deaths, and the good news is the government of Uganda's preparation teams and response seem to have identified, worked, and at this point, there's no reported additional transmission from those 6 cases that migrated from Beni into Uganda. That's a good news. About the only good news part of the story is that when it leaped the border, it was identified and contained. Okay. I was in DRC 3 weeks ago. That's already dated. Ramsey Day was there last week with our with Ambassador Green, the administrator of USAID. So I'm going to defer the freshest country report to Ramsey. When I went 3 weeks ago, it was one of the most sobering visits I've ever made on foreign travel. I had been to DRC with the malaria program. I know the country fairly well. But it was sobering in that it was clear what the objective was, but there was no clear strategy on how to get our arms around this and to contain it. It became clear not only to me, but to those that I was with, that it wasn't just a public health crisis. And I think that's the thing that we need to understand. It is a very, very complex public health emergency and should be linked directly to a failure in development, governance, and political support in one of the most insecure, dangerous two provinces in the world. This outbreak has been fueled by infighting and external fighting, organized gangs, armed groups. It has facilitated deep, deep community distrust and suspicion. Three vectors have come together to form a perfect storm. The virus. We know the virus. We can contain that sucker, but it's going in the wrong way. The community distrust, lack of compliance. This is, in theory, a response to benefit the community and their health. The community support and resistance has continued to point that vector in the wrong direction. And then the security and the insecurity in the area continues to proceed uninvaded. So you have three vectors that we need to address that are a result of political and development failure, all going in the wrong direction. So the question before all of us really is, how do we then respond? What can we do, and what should we do? I would like to say that while all of these tasks are very, very complex, they're not insurmountable. And I think it's incumbent on all of us who are engaging to roll up our sleeves and dedicate ourselves to getting this thing under control. There's been a lot of discussion on how we got where we got and the issues. We want to move beyond describing the situation and get into the phase of, okay, now what do we do about it? There are some significant shifts underway right now. We have been teaming up with our international partners, the World Bank, government of the UK government, and the EU, and they're the principal other investors in addition to the United States. And there was an acknowledgement that we need a total reset in three major areas: leadership and coordination of this response. WHO went in there with a 4-month horizon. 10 months into it, they're still there. They have a team of wonderful, committed, passionate people that are operating under significant risks, and they're looking at an extended horizon of 10 to 12 months. If you're in the HR business, in recruiting and retaining health experts that are operating in one of the most challenging places in the world, the notion of WHO's capacity to continue to lead and respond effectively, that margin continues to go down. So there was clearly a need to reset leadership and coordination and take it out of the hands of WHO. There needed to be a comprehensive strategy that didn't just address the health response, but all the other supporting components: community engagement, the engagement of the NGOs, a more robust, clearly defined prevention strategies for the 4 countries east of North Kivu, Goma, and Ituri province, and clarity on financing. If we push this out 10 to 12 months, the burn rate right now is about $1 million a day. You accelerate that through the end of the year, how many dollars is that? I won't project, but probably between 350 and 400 million. So if you're going to get donors to step up to the plate and invest significant cash, you got to have transparency and accountability, know where the cash is, know where the gaps are, so that we can clearly step up and say, we're all in this together. We don't have that today. So we made 3 recommendations. Need a complete overhaul of leadership and coordination. We need to have a plan that identifies the requirements. And thirdly, we need a mechanism that can account for funds. The good news is that we didn't just talk about it. There has been a significant shift at the UN, OCHA, and WHO senior levels to say, okay, we got it. We're supporting it. And we, the U.S. government, welcomes the appointment of David Gressley, American citizen who's been in the humanitarian business for years with the UN. He's a humanitarian expert. He's been in Somalia, Sudan. He understands the complexity of those complex areas. And he has been asked and accepted to be the UN Ebola coordinator. We're very, very grateful for that. I personally met with him. Some of you in here may have met with him. We ought to be celebrating the fact that we have a gentleman of his knowledge and expertise to work with the government of DRC and the UN and WHO and all the partners to move forward on a more integrated, coordinated plan. We welcome the fact that we have jump-started a new strategic plan. We hope to see that produced by the end of this month, July. That will be a coordinated plan that brings in the health as well as the supporting components that I referenced: security, community engagement, regional preparedness, financial accountability and transparency, and then long-term development. At the end of the day, as we peel the Band-Aid off this Ebola problem, we see that this is an area where it has been neglected. The development commitment in this area was not there. And so we have an opportunity post-Ebola then to continue to engage, to increase our development commitment and build systems and capacity in that area. Concerns moving forward, just having an organizational shift with a couple key people like Mr. Gressley isn't sufficient. We're going to have to get him a team that's funded, that's manned with the right people, and give him the capacity needed. We have a government that's still in transition. For those of you who've been following the government of DRC, you understand how fragile that is. We have a man who's committed with President Tshisekedi. The Minister of Health is a lame duck. The new cabinet probably will not be identified until September. So between now and September, we are working with Minister Lungi, who has had the Ebola response as his priority. But that whole government transition, while they're in the lead, represents an opportunity for us all to engage to help the president and the government of DRC move the agenda forward. There's been a less than optimum engagement of the NGOs. One of the things that we're pushing for is that we capitalize on the planning, the metrics, as well as the implementation of all of these significantly trained and NGOs that are in the area with capacity to continue to engage in the health response. So while there is a lot of challenges, there is a current plan forward. The United States government, underneath the leadership of Ambassador Hammer in DRC, has embraced a notion to totally reset how the United States government is going to engage as a whole of government response in leadership, in helping the security piece, the community piece, and the preparedness. That will be totally complementary with the SRP that's under development. So I think hopefully that kind of set the stage of why we're there, why the critical nature of this outbreak, but more importantly, there is a recognition of an adjustment, a reset, and a commitment that we got to do business differently. And the United States has made this a priority. We're all in, and we're going to continue to have to work pretty hard collectively with our international partners as well as our NGO partners and everyone else to pull this apart. Recognition goes to a number of folks. The White House is totally aware and involved. Secretary Pompeo has made this a priority. Secretary Azar has made this a priority. If you work with CDC, Dr. Redfield has made this a priority, and our Administrator Green, who just came back with Ramsey, has made this a priority. He's on the Hill right now. We are grateful that the Hill sees this as a priority and is looking at ways to help it. So let me just wrap up my comments, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Tim.
Okay.
I'm going to depart from what I think I was supposed to do, but I'm going to ask the panel to come up to the stage now. So we have some very distinguished panelists here to take this discussion a bit further, starting On my far right, not politically, but Ramsey Day, who's the Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Africa Bureau at USAID. He came to AID from 4 years at the International Republican Institute, and before that spent quite a bit of time with AID in Montenegro, I believe, and also in Washington. And next to him is Tomas Cihlar. Tomas is a PhD biochemist who works at Gilead Sciences, one of the pioneers in developing antiretrovirals for treating HIV/AIDS. Tomas, as I understand the story, checked the, I guess you call it the library of molecules that Gilead had when the first outbreak of Ebola occurred and found there was one that looked promising. It's one of the 4 drugs that's now being tested in DRC, and I think it's useful to have a scientific perspective on this. I should mention, Tomas is not here in his Gilead capacity, and I, by the way, have done some consulting and advising for Gilead also, which is not the purpose of our meeting today. Just want to make it clear that this is, in fact, our real concern today is in trying to contain this disease, not in finding cures once the containment has failed. And then, very importantly, Ken Isaacs, who's had a remarkable career in the, I guess you'd call it the non-governmental sector. He's vice president of Samaritan's Purse, which has done some pioneering work in Congo itself and has quite a few people on the front lines of this fight. And Ken has been out there previously. So we have actually, I'm going to start with Ramsey because Ramsey Day's just come back from visiting DRC with Administrator Green, and it might be good to have your first impressions from the front line.
Sure. Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me. I will preface all of my comments by saying that I don't have a technical background in health, so if I sound like a layman, it's because I am. But we had the opportunity to travel to Eastern DRC with Administrator Green last week. We visited Goma and then went up to Butembo and visited a Ebola treatment unit in Katwa. And I had just a few takeaways that I thought may help inform this discussion. And I think much of my comments are going to reinforce the Admiral's perspectives that he shared with us. But number one, and I think most importantly, the health workers that I met with and interacted with are doing a Herculean effort in this. They are facing death every day and under very, very difficult conditions. And so I think what we're seeing with the health workers there is just absolutely heroic. It was very clear to me that we know medically and technically exactly what to do. We've overcome this 9 times in the DRC. We overcame a huge outbreak in West Africa, obviously. But this is clearly much more than a public health emergency, as the Admiral mentioned. This is absolutely a failure of governance and a failure of politics, and it's a developmental emergency. So this was something that was absolutely clear to us. The protocols are being followed. They have been institutionalized and systematized. Facilities were very clean. I felt like some of the innovations that had been incorporated into the ETUs were quite innovative in that family members can now interact via a clear hard plastic, what they call cube, so they can see the treatment that their family members are undergoing and they can interact with them. So I think many of those kind of innovations are making a significant effort. Secondly, another takeaway that we had was that it's very clear that we need a holistic approach to this, and that it's not quite there yet. Again, as the Admiral mentioned, I think we're leaving a lot on the table in terms of the resources that are at our disposal. Many of the international and local NGOs that are operating in the area have been operating there for 20 to 25 years. And the response that has been at least up to date, I think, has left some of that on the table simply because the community distrust and the engagement, I think, has not been as robust as it possibly could. So I think it's a question that really needs to be answered is how can we integrate the local expertise and the international expertise better into this system. And I think lastly, I think there are some risks that will be absolutely critical to avoid. One is creating an Ebola economy, in that if we create a system that is responsive to the Ebola response, that is sucking up a tremendous amount of oxygen, once this response and outbreak is overcome and that system leaves the area, what is it left with? So I think we have to be very careful not to deteriorate or unravel the existing health system, as weak as it may be. There are, again, long-standing systems and international NGOs that have been developing and strengthening health centers all around the area, that have been working on measles outbreaks and cholera outbreaks. And a lot of this oxygen is being sucked up by the Ebola outbreak and the response. So I think it's absolutely critical that we ensure that there isn't a deterioration of those health centers and that health system, again, as weak as it may be. So when the international response is completed, that we haven't left them in a more difficult place than they're currently in. I'll stop there and we can continue the discussion.
Ken, let me turn to you. I should have noted in introducing you that you'd have major experience in disaster relief in the tsunami in Indonesia and also in the earthquake in Pakistan shortly after that. I'm wondering from that perspective, do you have how do you react to Ramsey's raising the issue of what happens after all the international apparatus goes away?
There's definitely an Ebola economy developing now. We see that everything from the renting of real estate to the renting of cars, labor rate. People that work for the MOH are not receiving their salaries. Guards are foisted as an NGO onto us, DRC military, to be the guards. We didn't want any guards. And so there are a lot of economic impacts. I'm pleased to hear that, let's say, a czar has been appointed. I do see it as a structural problem, and we don't see an easy way out of it. When we put all of our common thinking together, we can't see a way that it's going to end. And I think that there is a high likelihood of having a sense of a false security about vaccinations when you can't access people to vaccinate them. This gentleman right here will know more about vaccines than I do, but I'm going to guess that you probably need to get 80 or 85% for herd immunity, and that's not going to happen. So there are development considerations. It's a very, very complex circumstance. And as Admiral Ziemer said, we see it getting worse before it gets better.
What obstacles do you see in NGOs working on this?
Everything from social engagement. There is historically in Congo, in the eastern part, there's been fighting going on for the last 20 years. There's a divide between the east and west that there's considerations of ethnicity, of politics, of infrastructure, of economies. There are probably close to 100 armed groups moving around in the east. People are afraid. The health workers, as Ramsey just said, they're taking their lives into their own hands. But the citizens themselves they have a feeling of there's been a war going on here and we die by the thousands every month. And you're telling us to be wary of Ebola and it's only killed 1,500 people. That's almost like telling us to be afraid of lightning. So their thinking is not irrational, but there is an issue of proportionality. And being involved in Liberia in 2014 and knowing what happened there, we haven't seen that. And that comes back to this issue of the vaccine, some of the therapeutics. They do give a good outcome, but the number of people getting sick continues to grow. But to me, more worrisome is the geographical scope of it continues to spread. So it seems inevitable that at some point there will be a contamination in a populated area where people have not been vaccinated, where the vaccine can't be mobilized quick enough. And so these are some of the operational problems that we're seeing practically.
Mm-hmm. Tomas?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, Paul, and thank you very much for having me here. And I'm just coming from a little bit different angle, and you may wonder, the pharma industry, what we have to contribute. And, our story is very simple and very straightforward, because in 2014, in the midst of the West African outbreak, there really was the desperate situation, right? There were no drugs available that could be given to patients in the treatment centers. There were no vaccines until very end that could protect the uninfected population. But we sort of realized when it was really bad in the end of 2014 in West Africa, could we do something with our infrastructure, with our expertise in the discovery and development of antiviral drugs. So I've been primarily working for years in HIV and hepatitis drug discovery and development, but it was very easy to take our infrastructure and repurpose it and start a public-private partnership. We worked very closely with CDC, with the Department of Defense, and many other drug companies did as well, without much of the public advertisement. But within the years between the West African outbreak and now, I can say we're in a completely different position in terms of what kind of armamentarium we have in hands, both on the side of the vaccines. I can say that, and everybody would agree with me, if we didn't have the vaccine and 140,000 people being vaccinated, this outbreak would be blown out of proportion just because of the political situation that is there. So that was sort of at the forefront, but you also need to ask the question what you can do about the patients who actually get sick, right? Who get a disease that is terrible. It is 70% mortality rate in the DRC outbreak. It's higher than it was in the West Africa. And that's where I think most of the drug developers can step in. And so as a result, for us, what it means to do, it's important to do some organized, well-defined, objective clinical research, which is very difficult to do under these circumstances. But nevertheless, it actually succeeded in November of last year under the guidance of the WHO and NIH, and randomized clinical trials started in East Congo in multiple different treatment centers that basically asked the question of the 4 most advanced investigational drug products for Ebola, how they compare head-to-head with next to each other. The trial is ambitious, is large. It's going to enroll about 500 patients, but because of the number of cases, it's actually progressing very quickly. So the assumption is sometimes before the end of this year, we would have some results on what investigational drug products would be best. And you just don't do this to provide a treatment to the sick patients. I think this has the huge impact on the whole community, because if people who bring the health care and help, they can actually show that when you get to the treatment center, you can get treated productively, you can survive, and you come out as a live person. The mortality rate is not 70%. I think it has the huge positive impact on the whole community, because they realize that the treatment centers are not the places to come to die. I think the trust would be stronger. And it's very important to identify the cases of the patients at early stage of the disease, because at some point there is basically no point of return. The disease is so aggressive that ultimately it leads to the organ failure and collapse of the systemic circulation. And at that stage, none of the treatments, none of the drugs can help. So this is really the conundrum where when the community doesn't trust the healthcare providers, they don't come forward. The patients don't come to the treatment center at early stage of the disease, and it substantially diminishes the chance for them to survive and to be productively treated. So I think that's where I really see the role of the clinical research and the development of new productive drugs.
Thanks, Thomas. Can you add some insights talking to me earlier about why there's community resistance? I wondered if you might elaborate on that here.
About the burial of the child?
Yeah.
So I was in Congo we have an Ebola treatment center in a place called Komanda. And I was there 2 months ago. When I got out of the car, there was a woman screaming, and her 4-year-old child had just died. And later we would find out that the child tested negative, but the Red Cross burial team was there. It was about 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They were just looking at their watch. Mother's here crying, dad's here crying, screaming, wailing. Child's here in a body bag, and they're saying, well, you know, it's pretty late today. I don't think we can bury the child today. And so mother has a huge reaction. And then they changed their mind after about 5 minutes of discussion and said they would bury the child. And then they again flip-flopped back and said they wouldn't bury the child. So mom and dad grabs the body, runs out of the compound, and went into the community and buried the child themselves. And they sent the stretcher back to us 3 days later. There's a lack of social engagement in the sharing of information. There's huge distrust. People are wondering, why should I worry about Ebola? How, as the professor just said here, they do see ETCs, Ebola treatment centers, as a place to go die too often. And they need to have hope out of that. But they also need to understand the very essential aspects of infection prevention and control. And this information is not being shared. It's just not, the society in a way isn't conducive to the sharing of information, particularly with the insecurity and the distrust that's going on.
Tim, this is Washington, so I guess we have to talk money a little bit. And sometimes people say, well, your priority is measured by how much money you're spending. Could you give us a sort of thumbnail on the budgetary situation? Because I think you already alluded to the fact that this was planned for 4 months and we're already into 10, with more coming.
To date, funding hasn't been an issue for a couple reasons. Coming out of the 2014 outbreak, Congress approved a $1 billion or a multi-billion-dollar supplemental. The management of the balance of that has been done very carefully, and so we have had access to the balance of that. So there's a significant amount of funding that remains in there. However, it's focused and targeted for infectious disease outbreak, and so to date we have been able to fund through that. The real question is what's going to be needed in the future. As the U.S. government is committed to date, the bank has been very generous in funding it. The U.S. is, as always, the lead funder as a bilateral country. It's what is the requirement? What is the total funding requirement? And then how does the U.S. Step forward and continue to meet the need? We have a new benchmark that we want to be the lead. That's okay, but we want to cover our fair share. So there is a nominal target of covering about 25% of an international response. So that's also observed. So we have to balance that policy objective along with the overall funding. So today, funding doesn't constrain us from doing everything that we can see that's in the plan. The other restriction has been the trafficking in persons restriction that impacts a number of the development countries, DRC specifically. So some of the funding has been withheld because of that policy congressional mandate and the implementation by the current administration. The good news is there has been some reconsideration of that for the 2018 and accommodation to release some of that. But there are a number of moving parts that impede how we fund these very critical initiatives. So at this point, we're grateful for what we have. We thank the Congress for what they did, and we want to stay tuned so that we keep them up to speed on any additional requirements to respond to this global emergency. I hope that answers.
Could you or Ramsey explain a little more detail about this trafficking in persons issue?
Well, sure. So the Trafficking Victims Protection Act is legislation that prohibits the U.S. government from providing assistance to a government that is what's on what we call Tier 3 in the Trafficking in Persons report that's issued by the State Department every year. The Democratic Republic of Congo is now a Tier 3 country, which means that we are restricted in providing any government-to-government assistance or any assistance that would benefit the government. So there is the potential to get a presidential waiver, and that has not been issued yet. Of course, we have there are carve-outs and exemptions for humanitarian assistance, and so the immediate international development assistance funds, international disaster assistance funds, IDA funds are exempted from this. But the question is, as we were talking earlier, we need a holistic approach to this, and there needs to be developmental support within the communities, and some of those programs certainly have been impacted by this. The White House has been reluctant to issue waivers, country-level waivers, but we're in discussions now, and we believe that there could be a different posture. And if I can add maybe perhaps something that Ken mentioned too, and something that we observed on the community distrust issue, maybe just to kind of hammer this point home, and also to maybe give a little bit of a kind of an anecdotal perspective on this. We heard a lot of stories from local citizens, local community leaders, about how people will go in to get tested for Ebola having severe symptoms, high fever, vomiting, etc. But 90% of them are testing negative for Ebola, but they're getting turned away. And that in many ways is a problem, because it perpetuates this notion that the international community doesn't really care about me because I have other types of issues, cholera, malaria issues. You only care about Ebola, and you're only trying to keep this Ebola from moving across the border into an international realm. But you don't really care about me as a person. And that narrative is continuing to get perpetuated as people come in with these symptoms but then get turned away for treatment. So that's why I think it's so important to integrate the Ebola testing, the frontline testing, into the existing health centers. I know it has to be done safely and it has to be done properly, but I do think that's something that's really important. The other thing that we haven't yet to talk about really is the militarization of the response. It's somewhat intimidating to see these big, massive gunships come in and a 25-car convoy coming into your community, and then you're supposed to embrace this as a way of protecting your health. And I think this is something that we just have to be very, very sensitive to. I will be the first one to say that everyone's health and safety is absolutely paramount, and this is a highly, highly insecure area, but that's part of this riddle, is how do we balance the need to protect those who are working there without alienating the community and intimidating the community.
Let me jump in and just piggyback on that. So when I was there on my visit 3 weeks ago, I asked our WHO colleagues what their primary priority was, security. When I asked some of the other practitioners that were in that loop what their priority was, security. Turning to the NGOs or the community leaders, they all said less security. So the real challenge is to balance those two worlds, the humanitarian assistance approach to winning the hearts and minds and engaging with the community, with the absolute imperative need to keep the healthcare responders safe when they go out and do the work. It's counterintuitive to be more safe by providing less vehicles. So we have a little work to do to understand the context. Yeah. And I think it's also important to understand that it isn't the same all over the two provinces. Each community, each village, each city center has a different security dynamic. If you're up in Beni, it's the ADF. If you're down in Butembo, it's the Mai. And so the engagement with the security and the implications of that are different, 50, 60 kilometers separation. The suburb of Katwa to Butembo has a different community dynamic. So it's almost as though you're engaging differently in every outbreak area. And this notion that anybody from Washington or Geneva or London can come in with a graduate level solution is a joke. What we have to do is completely flip that paradigm. Start at the top, this mother with her kid, and say, okay, she is the community. Now, how is it? What are the possible areas to engage for communication and understanding so that we hopefully can achieve some sort of collegial receptivity to engage in this public health response? So I think the experts know the community engagement is the key. How we do that in a massive crisis area is really the challenge, because we want to get in, get it done, and get out, and it's going to be a long, long haul.
So just to reinforce what Ramsey said, at our Ebola treatment center, we've probably had, I don't know the exact numbers, but around 200 patients, and about 30 have died. And we've only had 5 that have tested positive for Ebola, and only 1 of those died. So using the therapeutics, we have saved the lives of the others. But the other endemic diseases in the state of health is very, very poor in the country. And I couldn't agree more with what General Ziemer just said about security. We work off of a security approach of engaging with the community, meeting with the leaders, meeting with the warlords. If guys have guns, it's a pretty good idea if they're your friends. You don't want to be antagonistic to them. And by trying to gain community support and openly sharing what we're doing, we have always found, and this is like a basic principle of development and relief anywhere in the world, that you need to be accepted by the community. But there's a feeling in the Congo that people from the outside are injected in a way that is not effective, and it isn't building trust.
Before I turn to the audience, any last comments or questions for the panel? Let me do that then. Shay?
Shay from SIZE.
Microphone?
Just remember to introduce yourself. Shay Katiri, Strategic Studies student at SIZE. And thank you very much to all of you, and especially thank you, Admiral Ziemer, for your military and now civilian service. To me, it appears that a lot of the problem is coming out, and not just the Ebola problem, but the very low human development index that Congo and the rest of the continent are stuck at. And to what extent is, so let me rephrase, and I believe that it is a lot due to unaccountable governments that African nations have to live under. What are the obstacles for the United States and other groups like World Bank, IMF, and other IGOs to move that human development index higher, and also make the governments in Congo and other countries more accountable?
I'm going to defer to the expert who runs the Africa Region Development Program.
I think it's an excellent question, and I think it's one that we're going to be answering in the Eastern DRC for quite some time. As I mentioned earlier, this is much more than a public health emergency. It's a development failure and a failure of government and politics. This area of the DRC has been ignored for 30 years, if not longer. Has gotten very few government services, very little electricity, if any, none of which has been provided by the government. One of the other issues that we continuously heard while we were there is that they were disenfranchised from the recent elections. And this is another major issue, because it reinforces the message that that this area is not important to Kinshasa. And that there was the view is that it was an intentional disenfranchisement, and that the narrative also is that Ebola has been brought to them as some sort of extermination plan. And so USAID will continue to be engaged. We have been engaged in the Eastern DRC. I believe that President Tshisekedi is somebody that we can work with, and I believe that he has a much greater understanding of the impact and just how serious this is. But again, I'll go back to my previous comments in that this can't only be about Ebola. So I think that speaks to your point in that this has to be a holistic, robust development assistance support process that goes well beyond the Ebola response.
This might take us off target, Paul, but
Try.
you can correct me, snap my suspenders from your World Bank experience. But I think you're asking a very important question about the Human Development Index factor. But in the world that I'm operating in, I'm supporting Ramsey to move the needle in the right direction. But in my world right now, I'm working in 6 areas where we have permanent response emergency teams stood up, responding to places that used to be above the threshold of the lowest development index. Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Venezuela, Bangladesh, and Burma. DRC falls into that argument. But where we are responding to global crises today doesn't necessarily link up to the argument of development index. It boils back to poor governance, breakdown in community care and treatment, and human behavior. And until we, not until we understand it, we understand the reality of that. But as we continue to engage in these very, very complex world situations, most of the attention and funding is going into complex crisis management caused by human beings, not by necessarily the immediate bug or virus. So I think as we have these bigger discussions, that the global development world is complex and is getting more complex, if that makes sense.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. I was just going to add one point on that, and that when we stood down the disaster assistance response team from the cyclone in Mozambique, that means that all 5 of our DART teams are dealing with complex emergencies that are human-made. We have 0 natural disaster response teams out there at the moment, and most of those, not all of them, but most of those have been long-term, complex responses. South Sudan, DRC, etc. And there are 70 million people displaced in this world today, the vast majority of which are displaced because of human conflict.
Throwing my 2 cents, I think it's wrong to say it's a human development issue. I think it's a government development issue. I think the problems are with governance more than they are with the human beings. Take those human beings from DRC or from West Africa, bring them to the United States, and you'll find them the most industrious, small business people, taxi drivers, whatever. They will work like crazy in an environment where their work will actually produce a reward. I think there are 2 aspects of the Congo governance situation that are not unique but extreme there, and one I would say is unique. The extreme one is the so-called resource curse, the effect that money generated from things dug up from the ground has a way of disappearing into the wrong pockets, and the people who actually produce it get very, very little in return. And that, in turn, empowers governments to stay in power that probably in any normal situation where they were accountable to their people would either be voted out or face a revolution that forces them out. And Congo has had that kind of government for a very long time. There's been a little bit of hopefulness since the election at the end of last year, but that's the problem that's unique to Congo. That election produced a president, I think, with very good intentions, but a government that is still basically the old government, oversimplify it, and a real deadlock, so that there hasn't been a cabinet appointed by the new president since the election on December 30th. That's a pretty long time. That includes the Minister of Health, who was, I guess, a holdover. I would offer a gratuitous suggestion both to my government colleagues and anyone from government who wants to listen. I think there's nothing wrong with a narrow focus at the moment. Ebola is a crisis, an emergency. Put a lot of pressure on Kabila, who's the guy who's the obstacle, to appoint a health minister that everyone would agree is somebody who can get the job done. If nothing else, you'll get the job done, or more likely will get the job done. And perhaps beyond that, you'll actually have, instead of an Ebola economy afterwards, you'll have an effective Ebola government afterwards. And Ken and I have experienced something like that, I think, in Aceh in western Indonesia after the tsunami, which was devastating, and you would have thought, it looked like Hiroshima, frankly, to fly over it. You thought it might never recover. It's not only recovered with some problem, there's always problematics, but they ended this 30-year-long insurgency and basically civil war, partly because the presence of outsiders put a spotlight on how the Indonesian army was misbehaving, put a spotlight on how the rebels were misbehaving, and brought in a great peace initiative, from the EU. I'm not saying the same thing could happen in DRC, but I must say I think instead of simply wringing our hands, oh, this might fail, it might spread internationally, all of that is true, and I'm a hand-wringer myself, but if this succeeds, it could be a model of something that could spread in a positive way, and putting some effort into doing that, I think, is worthwhile. Back.
Oh, sure. Thank you, gentlemen, for sharing your experience.
I should also say, please identify yourself and your affiliation.
Sure. My name is Joseph Mulalanguramu. Actually, I am from Butembo. Actually, thank you, Mr. Ray, for your leadership to fix this situation.
Good to see you, Joseph.
And thank you, Mr. Wolfowitz, for organizing this event. I just have one question for the Admiral, please. What are you currently doing to address the security situation in terms of helping the national government to address the security situation in Butembo?
Are you asking me or Admiral Ziemer?
Yeah, Admiral Ziemer.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. The responsibility to look at and assess any current security situation in Butembo and where we need to go lies underneath Mr. David Gressley. He was the leader of the MONUSCO force, so he understands the security risks, the opportunities, and the dynamics. So as he now takes the lead as the deputy underneath the UN special representative, his job is to coordinate the Ebola response. We are very hopeful because of his experience in DRC and his understanding of MONUSCO and the other forces that he will be able to help broker in a very positive way to not only understand but reduce the overall strategic risk within not only Butembo but the greater area, and then tailor that to accommodate this area security and stabilization effort. That sounds like a lot of words, but if anybody can move forward on assessing and then making the significant changes, I have a lot of confidence in Mr. David Gressley. We are going to support him. Our ambassador meets with him daily, and we're very, very interested in answering not only the Butembo question, but as this moves back up to Beni, where the dynamic is completely different, as you know, than Butembo.
Yes, sir. Back. And we'll get to the front here.
Thank you. My name is Ntal Alimasi, and I'm an independent consultant in governance and anti-corruption. So, one of the things that I want to go back to, even though at the beginning you said things that have been analyzed before, this is deja vu for many in the Congo. I happen to be actually from the DRC too. The deja vu in Eastern Africa is that what we have termed the Ebola economy has been there since 1994. Remember when the Rwandese came over and that international community helped the refugees and did not help the residents, the natives of the DRC. What came out of it was the type of distrust that you're seeing here. But not only the distrust towards those who have come in, but also towards the so-called helpers, the international NGOs that came in, which became actually the ones that were seen as bringing in more problems because they flashed money that the locals did not have, etc. So back to Beni and Butembo, what is happening right now is that you see people who are looking at international workers who live what you call high life, and they have nothing. But you couple that with this, what we have called the security part, where they say they need to be protected. And here, one thing we have not mentioned is the ADF, which is the international part of this coming from Uganda. Here we applauding Museveni and Ugandan government for really tackling but it's the ADF that's one of the problems for security. And this problem is translated for Beni and Butembo especially because the ADF has been there for many years. Many of the ADF has married, in the community. So they have the protection in the community that some of the soldiers coming from either Kinshasa or Equateur or the Kasai do not have. So you have that infighting you talked about that becomes a real big issue. And to end, and I'm going to end this here, then you have to consider that when you say you want to help in the security part of it. Because the infighting is coming from inside, but it's really from the outside. And last but not least, I was hoping to hear somebody talk about Professor Muyembe's antibodies, that monoclonal 114 that was done out of actual Ebola patients, and how that can be maybe included in the fight. So thank you.
That's a lot. I think you make a powerful point, which is we've heard, I think, correct statements that security and community resistance is something that's very local and can change. Someone said in a meeting I was at yesterday, it can change within 10 kilometers. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, there's a regional component that's international, actually, that is fueling the larger conflict, and you can't really separate the two. And I don't think maybe we have a genius on this panel, or maybe just somebody very daring who wants to say, how could we solve the bigger problem? I'm not sure we can, but I think your point that unless you tackle that bigger problem, which is an international one, a regional one, you're always going to have insecurity. But I would just applaud anyone who thinks they could take an initiative there. And by the way, I did refer earlier to that Indonesian experience. I wouldn't try to generalize from it, but in fact, it looked for years as though that conflict in Aceh could not be resolved. Once the spotlight was on it, because of the tsunami, you had some very powerful diplomatic efforts that came in that actually settled that conflict. It hasn't revived. I cross my fingers that maybe Ebola would bring in some kind of effort like that in the Great Lakes region. But let me go over here. First to you and then behind you.
All right, well, thank you very much. I'm Philip Meng. I lead the IOIG Family, an international humanitarian institution in children's rights. President Wolfowitz, Admiral Ziemer, Mr. Day, you've all mentioned, you've all spoke extensively about the kind of distrust in communities in Northeast Congo that are obstacles to solving the Ebola crisis. And institutions like ours, like the IOIG Family, we work in more than 130 countries, including both in DRC and in Western Uganda, where we operate education centers for public health. So my question to you is, what is the role of education, and specifically of education institutions like ours, in resolving a crisis like this one and preventing further outbreaks?
I think it's critical. USAID has supported the educational system in the DRC, which is largely through faith-based organizations and others, but also public schools as well. So I think it's absolutely critical. Integrating Ebola education into the school system will be also critical. I think it's probably another group that I don't believe has been integrated into this response as much as it potentially could be, is the faith-based community. It's a well-respected institute, a variety of well-respected institutions within DRC. So I do believe it's been underutilized. That's a good point.
Sir.
Good evening. My name is Telama Miabe. I am actually from Congo Brazzaville, and I'm the president of the National Congress for Democracy. I just want to say thank you to all of you. thank you to you, Dr. Wolfowitz, for the effort that you've done to do this conference. I also want to say thank you for you guys who work on these issues, because I'm very appalled with African government, and I'm among the new leadership of Africans who are sick and tired of seeing our leaders not being responsible. I believe that some of these issues could be much easier solved if we had responsible leadership. So basically, what we see in Africa is basically having always foreign countries, Europeans coming, Americans coming to solve our own issues. If we were responsible, we will be tackling those issues in a much easier way. So my question to you is that, I know you've dealt with some of these African government. What do you think that some of the activities that could have been done with the African government, particularly in Congo-Kinshasa, to solve some of these crises we've faced in Africa, whether it's Ebola or any type of crisis? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, I think it's an excellent point and something we talk about a lot at USAID. We talk about the organizing principle of what we call the journey to self-reliance. And it's just a pretty significant mindset shift within USAID that everything that we do needs to be in support of moving a country on to a day in which they can plan, finance, and implement their own development solutions to their own challenges. Not because we want to walk away from them, but because we believe that they can do it. But it does take a committed government, and it takes some level of capacity. We've developed what we call the USAID Journey to Self-Reliance roadmaps that helps us paint a picture as to where they are kind of on that journey. But the key element of that is really the commitment side. Capacity is important. You can go onto the USAID website. All of our roadmaps are posted on the website. But we've certainly learned that if you don't have a good partner to work with, then a lot of the development programs that we have available are not going to be as successful. So I think you're spot on. But where we have a good partner in the government, our programs seem to be effective. Their progress towards self-reliance is much faster. So these are absolutely critical elements. I think in the DRC context, the game has changed a bit. I think President Tshisekedi has a tremendous amount of challenges in front of him, but at the same time, we do believe he's somebody that we can work with. So we're very hopeful that he can put a government in place. Of course, the Minister of Health is a position that we're keenly aware of and hoping that will be in place very soon, because that's obviously critical to the Ebola response. But you're spot on.
Ken, you must have a lot of local people in your NGO efforts, right? So at the NGO level, it's less of an issue than at the official level, I'm imagining.
So I'm a very practical person, and I deal with people living and dying. And I've been doing this for 31 years. I first started working in Congo in 1988. So what we're talking about today is like this multi-layered, very complex issue of building a society. Let's be honest, billions of dollars have been spent in Eastern Congo over the last 20 years. And there's a failure of governance. So how can you go to a place like Goma and see so many mansions and go 10 kilometers out of the city and see such abject poverty? Why did the Chinese guys last week, 2 of them in front of one of my vehicles, why were they murdered for trading gold? There's a hospital in Nyankundi that we have supported for many years, and that hospital was set up there to help set orthopedic, broken bones from gold miners. And so people are desperate to make a living. They don't have the opportunity to make a living, and the reason they don't is a failure of governance. They have a lack of opportunity. But what we're here to talk about today is Ebola. So forgive me for being a cynic or a skeptic, but I don't think we're going to fix all the problems in DRC. The issue that isn't driving people to the point that Dr. Wolfowitz referenced in Aceh is enough people haven't died yet. If Ebola breaks out and does what it can do in 2014, you will see what the professor referenced. You'll see 100 or 200 or 300,000 people die, and it won't just be in Congo. It has the capacity to spread across borders, and everybody knows that, but nobody really wants to talk about that too much. But unfortunately, it's that kind of an event that will take a real, it'll be a catalyst to a change in human behavior. And then you'll get governments on board, then you'll get WHO on board. It sort of gets everybody focused in the same direction. So what I'm sort of seeing, excuse me for digressing,
No, this
is that all of these things about development and governance need to happen. But what do we do in the meantime where there's outbreaks? And to me, it's sort of like we need to have the international capability to mow the yard, to mow the grass. Where there's an outbreak, we're going to have to be able to move teams in to do vaccinations, to do safe and respectful burials, to do body management, to do community work. We've got to be able to respond. So this is sort of what I'm seeing. I don't know what my colleagues at AID are seeing, but some kind of capability is going to need to be developed and maintained, I think, to respond, because I don't see Ebola going away right now.
Other questions? Clay?
I'm going to abuse my role as an AEI Jean Kirkpatrick Fellow. This is a great panel. Thank you. A very important topic. I study authoritarianism and corruption, and I've become fascinated with the idea of transparency as basically credible aggregate data. And so I'm really fascinated by this question of how do you balance demands for lower security with demands for higher security. And with the use of credible aggregate data, what it does is it puts information in individuals' hands to make their own decisions with it in a better way. So as somebody that studies authoritarian governments, I tend to trust people more than I trust governments around the world. So in thinking about how to deal with Ebola, which I've been down in the National Science Museum and seen the fascinating exhibit they have there on infectious diseases, which is amazing, and I recommend to anybody. If you get the information, there's like very simple, low-cost ways to get information from large groups of people and then spread it in an aggregate way so that people can make more informed decisions. And I feel like that might be some way to balance that need for more security and need for less security by increasing transparency, by putting information in individuals' hands about where outbreaks are, what's going on, so they can make their own better decisions. And I'm just wondering if anybody would like to comment on that or.
Tim, any reaction?
No, I'm in agreement. But the application of the objective is how do we tailor that for this current outbreak? Getting back to what Ken said, this is all about containing this outbreak. In order to get the community to be more receptive and compliant, what is the immediate, what are the opportunities? And so what are the mechanisms needed to woo them, gain their confidence, allow them to respond to a transparency, honest assessment, engagement. It's very complicated. So when you started talking, I leaped right into financial transparency and accountability, which doesn't currently exist to the standard that we as a major donor want. I didn't anticipate you flipping it to the community, because the community engagement piece varies depending on which community and the engagement process and principle. So it probably requires another whole afternoon session to flush that out rather than just come up with a quick soundbite or not. Community engagement that solicits trust. Most of us have a hard time being on the receive end of things. We like to transmit. So I think we need to sometimes flip our transmitter off and receive. And that helps us to become more transparent, perhaps, and flexible as we listen to the beneficiaries of what we're trying to do. So I know that's kind of a rug dance around answering your question.
Another way of saying it's a great question.
Yes.
I will quickly add, though, as an old but enthusiastic democracy guy, I believe that transparency is a near panacea It doesn't solve the problems, but you can prevent most of them. It almost acts like a political blockchain, right? Because you're decentralizing how information is managed. And so if a government's committed to transparency, I mean, it's very difficult to do what a lot of governments have done behind the veil. So I couldn't agree more.
I think we'll have to make this the last question. Sir in front. Well, I'll take two at once. How's that? You and then a young lady behind you.
I'm Eric Mabalan from the South African Embassy. The question is, we're looking at pharmaceuticals somewhere based in somewhere in USA. We are not looking at the local person who's been dealing with local medication that can solve other problems within the African community. We don't look at this, the African solution. We're looking at the American solution towards the African. And we are actually talking to the elite in Africa. We're not talking about the poor lady who lost a child. That is the problem. The problem is we need to be more involved with the locals rather than the high and mighty politicians up there. That is the problem, the first problem. The second problem is, do not teach me, do not give me bread. Teach me how to make bread so that I can solve the problems after you have left. That is the second solution. Local solutions are better than imported solutions. That is what I'm going to say for today.
A good point. I agree strongly.
Yep.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Catherine Evans. I'm a founder of a group of nonprofits working with orphans, and thank you for this panel. We keep going back to the community engagement piece, so I'm just, even though that could be another panel, as was said, could you just share with us a few of the top most successful community engagement initiatives that are really working, that you're seeing a lot of success with? Talk about warlords.
In the DRC or just generally?
I guess DRC, since we're focused here on the DRC.
Well, perhaps I'll maybe expand the aperture just a little bit. I mean, maybe we can bring it back to the Ebola conversation, and that if you look at the 2014 to 2016 outbreak, it was not until the community gained real ownership that turned the corner in that outbreak response. And so I think that's our overall message here, is that until we do that, and perhaps that's also pointing to your comment as well. Until we do that, I think we're still going to struggle with this particular outbreak. So we have a lot of community engagement programs globally, but very few of them have really been directed at Eastern DRC in the context of this Ebola outbreak. So until we do so, until that gets integrated into it, I think we're still going to struggle.
Oops.
Could I add to that, Paul?
Please.
As an organization, we put the highest value on engaging with the community. So the day after the child was buried, I went up into the village of Comanda because I know that our security is directly linked to community affiliation. And I met with the chief, and I asked if he would assemble whoever he wanted to and just let me come and talk to them. I instill in my staff how important it is to get into the space and the mind of the people that are there. They need to understand, we need to understand, no matter where you're from, and I've got people, I have 5,000 people working for me from all over the world. But it doesn't matter where you go, you need to understand what people are dealing with where they are. And I spent 3 hours talking to about 250 people and telling them what I knew and listening to what, and they were all over the place, and you know better than I, they had a very wide-ranging conversation. But it was off of that platform that we have not had any security problems in Comanda. The community came to understand and trust, so we've built off of that, and we keep those conversations going. That's just an example. But we try to do that everywhere that we are. We're working heavily in Bunia, teaching frontline providers. This is right up in the northeast part of Ituri. And, but the community conversation, the community engagement is of the utmost importance. If the community does not accept you there, there's nothing you can do. You're going to be out. And in Congo, there's tension between the capital, between the north, between the south, between the east, between the west, and even, as was said earlier, 10 kilometers away It's a totally different dynamic. And you've got to be applicable to each one of those scenarios as an organization, as an entity.
Before we wrap up, just any closing comments, Ramsey?
No, I appreciate you doing this discussion and participating in many others. I think it's absolutely essential that we raise awareness of this issue. Even though the numbers aren't what they were in West Africa in 2014, this is not going the direction that we want to, and it's moving in a direction towards a high population center, and there are international airports within a few hours' drive of that. So this is an absolutely critical issue, which is why it needs the additional attention. So thanks for bringing this up.
Tomas, any comment?
Well, first of all, thank you for convening the panel. I think this was fascinating discussion. And my sort of final comments and thought, really, I would like to extend the comments on the education, right? Because you can really look at many different levels of the education. The one is the basic information, what is Ebola, how it's transmitted, what you shouldn't do to get it, right? And that's really the way, the efficient way how to communicate it into the local population is totally essential. Then you could have a different level, higher level of education that actually brings the local experts who understand how to respond to Ebola, who know how to build the infrastructure, who actually know how to take care of the patients. And that is something that is being done, but maybe not to the full extent. To some extent, the fact that the insecurity actually pushed some of the NGOs out, it vacated the space that I think the local expert and local healthcare providers needed to fill in. And that, I think, was the positive outcome and opportunity that the locals actually get engaged into the response. And I think that is really essential for the success here.
Ken?
Thank you for convening this and for having the opportunity to come and share with you. I think it is I think it's an issue that needs to be elevated as far as an international humanitarian crisis. I think WHO calls it a special concern or something the next level up. But thank you. That's my words.
Tim?
Thanks to AI. Thanks to you, Paul. It's good to see you again. Thank you for all of your time and the questions. They're really excellent. We don't know how close we are to extremis in this current outbreak. We have plans in place. We have hopes that this new strategy, we have hopes that the new president, we have hopes that a new cabinet, we have hopes that there'll be an orientation of community engagement and dealing with these complex security situations. So the real question is, let me flip it over. As you are taxpayers, leaders of organizations, and thinking units, please don't be shy in rattling the cage and challenging and agitating and then supporting from your perch as we look at this, because this is an international issue. It has high U.S. national significance, and I think we're all in this together. And it's easy to say, but I'm encouraged that you would spend your time here with us to discuss this, because it's a big deal, and we're going to need everybody's understanding and engagement.
I just want to say I'm very glad you failed retirement by taking on the malaria challenge, and I'm delightful that you're failing another time by taking on the Ebola challenge. So thank you for that, and thank all of my panel for spending their time with us today, and all of you for being here. Thank you very much.
Here, here. I don't know if it's on. This is more productive than last night. Yes, actually. You look at the audience. These are people who are learning. Yeah. Everybody in that group last night already knew what we were telling.